and also the respondents to those papers. Now, you probably had a chance to quickly read the papers, but it'd be very helpful to have that background before we hear our speakers this morning. This is a great delight for me personally to welcome the two presenters today who I've worked with previously and they're personal friends of mine. I want you to please to greet Major Dr. Dean Pallant, who's going to come and share with us his paper on what is the Salvation Army's theology as we serve suffering humanity. Please, over to Dean.
Thank you. The question, what is the Salvation Army's theology as we serve suffering humanity, raises a number of other questions. What do we mean by theology? Is there only one Salvation Army theology? Who determines Salvation Army theology? To begin to answer these questions, we're going to discuss four voices of theological insight that shape Salvation Army theology as we serve suffering humanity. The first is authoritative theology. The Salvation Army's theology is based on the Bible and expanded in the Salvation Army Handbook of Doctrine. These are our primary sources of authoritative theology. However, many give authority also to the writings of our founders, William and Catherine Booth, and others to John Wesley. Second, we have academic theology. What do the experts say? Salvation Army social work is increasingly influenced by universities and professional bodies. In our early days, Salvation Army officers were discouraged from going to university. This has changed. Now many of our training colleges are accredited to universities. Academic teaching from the faculties of theology, but also from business, social science, education, medicine, that influences how do we serve suffering humanity. I think there will be tensions between these two voices, and we need to identify them and understand them. Thirdly, approved theology. At this point, let me say that as the organizer of this event, I'm the one person whose paper is incorrectly printed in your manual. And so the latest version of my paper didn't get there, but that's online. And I want to use approved. I want to keep 4 A's for you. So the approved theology is my slight revision. In our day-to-day work, serving suffering humanity, we rely on a vast range of contemporary documents that have been approved by the Salvation Army. One army, one mission, one message, mission statements, those sorts of branding statements. We have our moral and social positional statements. We have strategic plans. We have project proposals. In these documents, we say what we're going to do. We set out the organization's approved way of working. These documents carry theological meaning, and they are an opportunity for us to articulate what God is saying we should be doing in this time and place. Now, the texts do not carry the same authority as the Bible or the Handbook of Doctrine. They change. But they are very important sources of theological intent. And fourthly, action theology. What do we actually do? Our actions are full of theological meaning. We are a Christian church known for our authentic deeds, rather than for our authoritative or our academic theology. Therefore, our actions need to be carefully examined, understood, and refined in the light of our theology. So in this paper, I hope to bring these four voices into dialogue with each other. The voices are not always in harmony, but it's important that we hear the four voices as we try to answer the question, what is the Salvation Army's theology as we serve suffering humanity? So firstly, on authoritative theology. I'm going to focus on the Handbook of Doctrine, the writings of William and Catherine Booth, to show how Salvation Army authoritative theology has developed in the last 150 years. In the early years of their ministry, the Booths preached an individual salvation and the blessing of holiness as they were traveling preachers around England. Catherine, the theologian in the family, had an orthodox Wesleyan holiness understanding of salvation. In a sermon in 1881 in Exeter, Catherine taught the gospel was more than just saving souls. It is a scheme of salvation. It is not a scheme of salvation merely. It is a scheme of restoration. He proposes to restore me, brain, heart, soul, spirit, body, every fiber of my nature, to restore me perfectly, to conform me wholly to the image of his Son. After Catherine died in 1890, the Army's work in serving suffering humanity expanded rapidly. Informed by the experience of life for poor people in the East End of London and his Wesleyan heritage, William understood that people required total transformation, including physical, social relationships with family, friends, society, the workplace, the nation, the world. William repeatedly refused to accept any salvation of the body without salvation for the soul. In his influential book, In Darkest England and the Way Out, William conceived of the Salvation Army playing a key role in the total transformation of the whole world for God. William, interestingly, did not make worship a condition of participation in any social program. He argued that Salvation Army worship should be so attractive that people would not want to miss it. He placed the onus on salvationists to attract people into the kingdom rather than using coercive methods. This is a theology still relevant in 2014. William was not ministering to the poor in order to create a more stable society. Rather, as Roger Green writes, Booth was primarily an evangelist and a revivalist, pressing the hope that spiritual regeneration would manifest itself in social stability. This conclusion is foundational to a Salvation Army theology of serving suffering humanity in the 21st century. We are not faithful to Booth's vision if we reduce serving suffering humanity to merely helping people, securing their human rights, or becoming good citizens, or building a more just and stable society. We do all of that, but we do more. We are participants in God's mission to redeem the world. The 11 doctrines of the Salvation Army focus on the nature of God and personal salvation. There's no mention of serving suffering humanity or mission. In the previous editions of the Handbook of Doctrine, there is very little reference to a theology of serving suffering humanity. Perhaps this absence of an authoritative theology has encouraged some Salvationists to have a priority for matters of the soul over matters of the body. This weakness was addressed in recent editions. The 2010 edition of the Handbook of Doctrine states, all our activities, practical, social, and spiritual, arise out of our basic conviction of the reality of God's love and our desire to see all people brought into relationship with Him. None of our practices or programs can be divorced from the reality that salvation is both a promise and a possibility for all people. Our doctrine reminds us that salvation is holistic. The work of the Holy Spirit touches all areas of our life and personality, all physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being, all our relationships with our families and with the world around us. There are a number of other helpful quotes in the 2010 Handbook of Doctrine that I've put in the footnotes, and please let me just say that I just wish we would use that book more. Why do we not use the Handbook of Doctrine more? It's a fantastic resource. So, our authoritative theology is not static. For example, Salvation Army official teaching on the nature of people has developed over time. The 1923 edition of the Handbook teaches that the body is a lower order to the soul. That was in our 1923 doctrine book. Man, as we see and know him, is one being, yet he has both a body and a soul, or a lower and a higher nature. By 1998, there is hardly a mention of body and soul, and a much greater emphasis on the Trinity as relational, and some references to the relationality of persons. By the 2010 version of the doctrine book, we have the relationality teaching, but adds an explicit rejection of body-soul dualism. In salvationist faith and practice, the wholeness of the person is crucial. It is reflected in the combination of our evangelistic and social work. Any dualistic teaching which separates body and soul that suggest the body is either less important or evil must be resisted, as it can lead to unhealthy or immoral practice. Salvationist teaching must clearly present the wholeness of the individual as a basis for personal spiritual life and mission in the world. This is important teaching in at least two respects. First, it shows that our authoritative theology develops over time. The Salvation Army's understanding of body and soul, at least in our authoritative theology, has shifted in 75 years. Secondly, the Salvation Army's authoritative theology emphasizes the wholeness of the individual, or the wholeness of the person, as the basis for mission in the world, the basis for serving suffering humanity. It is also worth noting that the global evangelical church went on a similar journey in the 20th century. The Lausanne movement, initiated by Billy Graham and John Stott, has helped evangelicals understand the richness of the whole gospel for the whole person, for the whole world. So, academic theology. Academic theology can also inform our salvationist theology of serving suffering humanity in many ways. I completed a doctorate in theology in 2011, and I learned much. And one of the most interesting lessons I learned was the Greek concept of telos. Telos was a concept used by Aristotle. It means our orientation, our goal, our purpose, our direction. It's not merely a guiding light for occasional reference by the pilgrim. It's a rich, dense concept that can be explored and lived out. Alistair MacIntyre, the eminent philosopher, argues, it is only possible to understand the dominant moral culture of advanced modernity properly from a standpoint external to that culture. In other words, for any person or group to live well, we need a clear understanding of where we're going, something beyond ourselves. Without that clarity of telos, we do not know what we are aiming for. We float around without direction. Telos is not something we pick up and put down as it suits us. It captures our whole being. Kierkegaard said, "Purity of heart is to will one thing." We need a singleness of purpose for the whole of life. It has no application unless it is for the whole of life. MacIntyre helped me understand the challenge the Salvation Army faces, serving suffering humanity. It is a mistake to presume we are speaking the same language as our partners when we are serving suffering humanity. We rarely share the same telos. There are a number of teloses being used by governments, corporate partners, NGOs, even other faith-based organizations. There is a tendency for secular agencies to use fragments of lost moral traditions, especially fragments of the Christian tradition. And they become abstracted from the shared notion of what constitutes the good life and human flourishing. So what does the Salvation Army's telos? Well, there can only be one. Here's my slogan: one army, one message, one telos. That's going to take off. Our telos is more than our mission. It's our orientation. It's our direction. I've used the term healthy persons to try to describe our telos. People who are restored to be what God created them to be. Healthy in body and soul and relationships. This is not the same as the telos of other NGOs and the humanists who try to develop people to be autonomous, rational individuals. This is not our telos. We have a rich appreciation of people created by God as body, soul for relationships. Healthy persons whose lives are orientated by the gospel of Jesus Christ, whose lives are characterized by their relationship with God and are faithfully present, serving Him in the world. The telos of healthy persons transcends geographical, economic, and racial boundaries. Our approved theology. So this is now, what do we say we're actually going to do? And our approved theology is found in many places. You're going to be much more familiar now, I think, with our approved theology. This is the John Gowan's three-legged stool: saving souls, growing saints, and serving suffering humanity. And I use this picture around the world to challenge those who emphasize one leg. We have a lot of programs that live on one leg. They either serve suffering humanity or they perhaps keep the saints happy and occasionally save souls. We need to connect these legs. The other example of the approved theology is faith-based facilitation. And on the table, most of you will be aware of this, but I've put the booklet, Building Deeper Relationships, there. It's also available for a download if you're listening to this on the web. But this is the reflective cycle of faith-based facilitation. It's been approved by the IMC during the time of General Clifton. It's translated into 10 languages. And it's a way of working, a way of being that used by many Salvationists around the world to take issues and understand them and reflect in the light of our biblical truths and our tradition, our approved theology, our academic theology, and bring it into the power of the Holy Spirit through that kairos moment. Faith-based facilitation has the 4 elements of the Wesleyan quadrilateral: Scripture, tradition, reason, and experience. But by adopting an action-reflection process, which many of you will be familiar with from your social science practice, this brings this into our faith-based work. I believe this can be used by people of many faiths and none. We need to understand what values we are bringing to the table when we are reflective practitioners. But we are a holiness movement, and the Spirit is at the center, the kairos is at the center, and it influences all levels. I haven't got time to do any more of this. I must move on to our action theology. This is the theology we actually do. When millions of Salvationists and their employees and our volunteers, when they're serving suffering humanity in Salvation Army programs, they are living their theology. They have their own motivation for working for the Salvation Army. Some of us believe we are doing God's will and see our service as an integral part of the response to Christ's call to be disciples. Others may not believe in God, but like to work for the Salvation Army because we help people. Some may see it as work, a way of paying the bills. I believe we have to be very careful in our attention to action theology. What action theology are our colleagues using, and what are we using in our day-to-day lives? It influences the people we seek to serve much more than the other 4 voices of our theology. The Salvation Army has historically been good at action theology. We've learnt much from the voice of practice. We believe God speaks to us in our day-to-day ministry. The Holy Spirit challenges us during our encounters with the real world. We recognize the grace of God in our world. Often we can only see the work of God retrospectively, but we know there is a prevenient grace at work in the world. Salvationists know that God is not only found in the Bible, in the doctrine book, in the university thesis, in the positional statement. We fervently believe that God speaks to us in the gutter, in the workplace, in the shops, in the home. This willingness to recognize God at work in the world has saved the Salvation Army from the ugliness and detachment of self-righteous holiness. Our action theology keeps us rooted in the world, always seeking the kairos experience. In passing, let me say that I believe it is this willingness to learn from the voice of action theology that will help the Salvation Army navigate the current dangers facing us with our relationship with the lesbian and gay community. When we know, care, and learn from gay people, God will help us to find a faithful response. In conclusion, how do we continue a conversation about the Salvation Army's theology for serving suffering humanity? We need a dynamic, never static theology for our movement. We live in a dynamic, changing world. The Holy Spirit is always speaking, inspiring, energizing. Serving suffering humanity is a journey. We need resources for the journey. We need partners on the journey. We need to create spaces to hear the 4 voices of theology in our ministry and on our journey. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you to Major Dean for that excellent paper. You've had a chance to read it, as you've heard this morning, sitting here, and you have responses in your mind, I suspect, to some of the things that Dean raised, and you'll have a chance shortly in the session to be able to document some of those thoughts in your groups at your tables. And those online will have opportunity to send information and responses back to us here at the conference. I also want to recognise that we've asked some people to formally respond to the papers that have been presented today, and so the very difficult task of having to do a formal response, Claudia, I believe. But I'm going to invite, please, Claudia Franchetti from the South American East Territory to come and give a response, please, to Dean's paper. Let's greet Claudia.
The answer to this question is not easy but necessary. It was helpful to address the question using the concept of theology in four voices, as it gives us a starting point. As I read the paper, I tried to figure out how present these four voices are in the field, in the mission opportunities I have the privilege to support as project officer and as a soldier of the Salvation Army. I fully agree with Major Pallant that action theology has more influence on the people we seek to serve than our authoritative, academic, or approved theologies. The collective imagination of the Salvation Army is centered on people doing good things for others. Although this close connection to the action has saved us from self-righteous holiness and helped us to navigate through the rapids of controversial issues, sometimes we are blind sailors. Authoritative theology is very much connected to the history of the Salvation Army. For common people, these are old-fashioned statements, things that happened in the past. Hardly anyone can really see how the authoritative theology can help him or her to make daily decisions. The academic theology has a growing presence in our training colleges, and this is very good. But I agree with Major Pallant that tensions between these two voices need to be identified, understood, and addressed. By so doing, we will keep on growing in our understanding and commitment towards our theology. Then these two voices, as they converge, like two streams coming together, they are communicated to the Salvationists and other people as well. The approved theology emerges as an institutional message to orientate and clarify our ministry. What I noticed from my personal experience is that these four voices are not equally present in our daily ministry. People in the field do not have access to or are not interested in authoritative and academic theologies. The closest they come to this is through the approved theology, but mostly in a visual and advertisement way. They may remember the slogan of the territory, or they may be able to identify the International Vision logo, but very few will go deeper and dare to unpack the content behind or underneath the statements. This makes us really think on the importance of communication. How do we communicate our approved theology? How do we make it accessible to all people without losing its richness and profoundness? In addition to distance, there is the timing issue. Action theology moves faster and quicker than the other voices. We discover questions and situations that do not fall into the structure. Action theology fits and challenges the other voices. Unfortunately, in these days, we in the Salvation Army take too long to realize these critical issues and respond to them in a profound and exhaustive way. We may provide a practical response, but with a very weak, if not non-existent, theological backup. That's how action theology is somehow divorced from the other voices, a time and distance separation. This separation weakens the four voices and makes us more vulnerable to all kinds of winds of doctrine. How can we create spaces to hear the four voices of theology in our ministry? Bringing them closer in terms of space and time. Scholars and practitioners have to increase their connections. They have to know each other, understand better their realities, and share their faith. How can we create spaces to hear the four voices of theology in our ministry? Setting apart resources, mainly time, for reflection at all levels, and being intentional in our theology making. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Claudia for that response to the paper. I'm now going to invite our second presenter for this morning's session to come and share his paper with us, and we're very delighted to have Major Campbell Roberts, sort of the founder, here with us. Good friend of mine, and Campbell has also a very well-approached understanding of this subject, and so we're going to look forward to your comments. Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Campbell. Please greet him.
Thank you, Grant. It's great to be here and a great privilege to be part of this situation. I'm glad that the OF has been explained. I thought it was old full, and it was a sort of some situation that Dean and Graham had created. For most of us, the reality of our ministry is serving a never-ending queue of suffering humanity. People impacted by the scourges of poverty, loneliness, addiction, criminal offending, homelessness, human trafficking, and a whole host of others human suffering. Internationally, this torrent of human need is responded to by a Salvation Army ready with immediate care, crisis management, practical love, professional skills and training. Motivating Salvationists to make such a response is the impact and reality of God's love and salvation operating in our individual lives. Salvationists on whole are pragmatic people, and the Salvation Army is a pragmatic organisation, keen to respond immediately to need rather than to spend time reflecting on theology that might lead to this serving of suffering humanity. I'm going to look at New Zealand, and I don't do that because it has any value as an example in itself, but simply as a way of illustrating what I want to say. From the post-war period to the 1990s, the approach of the Salvation Army in New Zealand in meeting need was similarly pragmatic, albeit using, where possible, the best of healing therapies and professionally competent staff. Although leadership would have denied it, the link between serving suffering humanity and biblical theology had become organisationally isolated and theologically tentative. Over the past 10 years in New Zealand, a change has occurred that has seen a stronger link between the Army's theology and the service's meeting need. There has been a closer alignment between evangelistic and social theology, core and social services, theology and practice, social service and social reform has occurred, and this combination has occurred to the point that it could be said that the link between the theology of the Army and suffering humanity has strengthened considerably. This change had mixed drivers, including a more aggressive and comprehensive territorial mission setting process and strategy that has unified theology and practice, an organisational change that has seen most core embracing community ministry, Just Action social justice conferences, which have brought together the area of social justice, the birth of recovery churches in addiction services, a deliberate Christian mission focus on social services, and the establishment of the Salvation Army's social policy and parliamentary unit. Theologically based approaches to serving then suffering humanity have developed as Salvationists have more deeply understood and appreciated the Salvation Army's historical mandate and theology. At this stage, it's a little too early to evaluate what that change is, whether that change is a permanent change, or in how the Salvation Army in New Zealand undertakes its ministry, or whether other environmental or international factors may arrest this approach. But certainly at this point, there is this developing closeness between theology and practice. I offer, therefore, in this place a description of the New Zealand journey in this change, again emphasising this isn't just a journey that can be replicated other places, but as an example of what Salvation Army theology can look like when serving suffering humanity. From an early period, the Salvation Army in New Zealand, in line with international trends and I guess in line with many other territories, separated its evangelistic and social wings administratively, financially and missionally. This separation became entrenched to the point where the social and evangelical work of the Army happened in two entities, with Salvation Army's officers divided into either field officers or social officers, and that will be a pattern that will be known to many of you. This divide increased in the 1950s to 70s as social and health services in New Zealand moved to more strongly specialise and professionalise. The result was an external environment demanding more professional practice, staff better educated in social sciences, and the requirement of more accountability in government funding contracts. The Salvation Army's theological imprimatur on its social service operation at this time could best be described, I think, as a loose belief that loving God meant loving others. Hence, social services were justified as Christian acts of love. And while this practice model of Christian love was appropriate overall, the theological understanding and rationale for service was not articulated or understood. Christian pragmatism, rather than Christian theology, influenced how the Salvation Army undertook its social and public ministry. In the 1980s, a rethinking of the integration between service and theology commenced in the Salvation Army in New Zealand. Contributing to this change, strangely, were, I think, important influences externally, environmental factors and the other, so these two environmental factors, but also a new concentration on biblical theology, particularly from a training college. Strangely, an economic philosophy, as I say, contributed to the Salvation Army reconnecting in greater depths to its theological foundation. And that was the dominance of economic liberalism as the major policy document in New Zealand, which came with a Labour government in 1984 and changed how New Zealand acted as a society and how individual Kiwis treated each other. So that whole rise of economic liberalism actually brought a change in how the Salvation Army operated. The marks of that economic liberalism were self-interest, individualisation, dominance of the market, secularism, competitiveness rather than cooperation, and an increasing gap between rich and poor became increasingly the markers of New Zealand life. These economically liberal policies resulted in a new poor. People found themselves in poverty, disenfranchised from the norms of New Zealand society, in low-quality housing, limited employment opportunities, often victims of crime, and susceptible to social hazards. The impact of this new economic doctrine on Army Corps was to create a reinterpretation, I think, of core mission, worship and service. What followed has been a loss. What had happened, I think, in our Corps, there had been a loss of certainty in core ministry, created, I think, by the church growth movement, and also by a move away from perhaps a denominational emphasis of the army into a sort of community church approach. And therefore there had come a theological uncertainty. There are obviously links in this new economic liberalism to the situations for the poor in Booth, London. And so Salvationists became suddenly more interested in embracing the historical mandate of the army and exploring that theology and that history and the theological roots of Wesley and Booth. Similarly, in social services, a new emphasis developed on creating Christian community, which was added to the following of professional practices and therapies. This result of weaving people into a patchwork of Christian community meant the marginalised suddenly became known, named and included within Salvation Army communities in core and social centres. Our congregation in New Zealand became less middle class, with many congregations increasingly now comprising people who have come through our Salvation Army social services. The embracing then of economic liberalism and public policy was a wake-up call that helped the Army in New Zealand to rediscover its own theological and historical roots. Another external factor influential in the reconnection of Salvationists with their faith taproots has been increasing awareness in New Zealand public life of biculturalism and the honouring of the Treaty of Waitangi. The Treaty of Waitangi is the founding document of New Zealand and was a treaty signed in 1840 between Indigenous New Zealanders, the Māori, and the British Crown. In recent years, New Zealand has been challenged to better recognise the bicultural partnership created by the treaty in public policy and in its social and economic life. Although New Zealand is traditionally a very secular state, perhaps amongst the most secular states in the world, to more suddenly to recognise Māori people, there had to be a greater regard for faith and spiritual dimension of life, as these were essential elements of Māori life and of Māoritanga. One public aspect of this that started to happen in government is that Māori religious ceremony and prayer were associated into items of public life. And so in government occasions there were what was called welcomes, pōwhiri, and this recognition also provided new opportunities for faith communities to receive public acknowledgement of their own faith traditions, because in recognising the spirituality of Māori people, it also became necessary to recognise the whole faith tradition. And that created a tremendous opportunity for us within the church and within the Salvation Army. An example of this is found in the Memorandum of Understanding between the Salvation Army and the state through the Ministry of Social Development. And so in this state document, this is what it reads. The Ministry of Social Development acknowledges that the Salvation Army is an evangelical church and human service provider with its message based on the Bible, its ministry motivated by the love of God, and its mission to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ and meet human need without discrimination. This involves the Salvation Army in caring for people, transforming lives through God in Christ and the power of the Holy Spirit, and working for the reform of society by alleviating poverty, deprivation and disadvantage, and by challenging evil, injustice and oppression. And I remind you that that's a state document in terms of our relationship with the Army. This statement is a significant acknowledgement of the faith tradition and motivation of the Salvation Army in its contracts with government. By incorporating the Salvation Army mission in its partnership agreement, government not only recognised the right to encompass spiritual processes in the transformation and care of people, but also, and I don't know that it fully recognised this when it did it, but it also recognised that on occasions the Army will challenge the state and will oppose government policy and practice in seeking the reform of society. I suspect this opportunity to have government sanction and encouragement of our spirituality as well as humanitarian purpose is possibly unique in a sort of international context, but a very important one for us. The Treaty of Waitangi then is another example of an external influence that has served to nurture a rediscovery and re-emphasis of the Salvation Army's theological story and journey. Internally, the rediscovery of theological roots also occurred. So it wasn't only these external factors, but also some movement internally. There was a greater understanding of the biblical theme of justice, a deeper faith-to-life connection, increased biblical literacy, and a desire to be missional in a way that makes a real difference in people's everyday life. As a result, social service work in New Zealand is now largely integrated into Salvation Army Corps. 10 years ago, few Salvation Army Corps included social or community expressions as part of their congregational life. Where social service assistance was given, it would have been undertaken by a Corps officer, and now nearly all New Zealand Corps have a community of social expression with appropriate training and engagement of soldiers and adherents. And increasingly the community is seen as the centre of the Corps mission rather than perhaps the Corps. Salvationists seem willing to embrace actively that part of our theological DNA which understands that no one is beyond redemption or separated from the grace and love of God. An example of that is that 5 years ago, the Territory commenced addiction rehabilitation work alongside the Mongrel Mob, one of New Zealand's largest and most troublesome criminal gangs. This work was difficult for the Army Addiction Service to undertake because it had almost universal community rejection. It was felt that service should not be offered to criminal gangs and to these gang members who were so disruptive of New Zealand life. And also a complication was added in that the gang insisted on contributing and commenting on all treatment methodologies. And so without a strong connection to our theological and biblical mandate, I firmly believe this work would have failed dramatically. Professional treatment methodologies alone could not have effectively sustained what turned out to be a very challenging journey. The faith component and theological touchstones enabled officers and staff to remain with the mob despite immense hurdles. Through this program, numbers of the mob have turned their life around, beaten their drug and alcohol habits, and on their way to new journeys in terms of their life and new contributions in terms of their life in New Zealand society. As the Salvation Army in New Zealand has rediscovered its Wesleyan Booth roots, the Territory has focused its ministry on the causes and not just the effects of poverty and need. 9 years ago, the Territory was led to question the effectiveness of its social services, and it went back and looked at how effective its social services had been in changing New Zealand society. It perhaps won't be a surprise to you to know that when we looked at those 10 indicators of areas in which we were working, all of the areas had got worse in the previous 10 years. And that in spite our significant efforts in social provision, the Salvation Army had failed to arrest a decline in the social circumstances of New Zealand's most vulnerable groups in all areas in which it was working. And although some people came to faith and thousands were cared for and individual lives were changed, with regard to the gospel imperative to create a more just society, we in fact were achieving very little. To change this situation, Salvation Army leadership, in a very encouraging way, established a specialist unit focused on engaging with social policy and the causes of injustice. And I commend territorial leadership both then and since then in terms of supporting what has been quite a risky experiment. This new entity, the Social Policy and Parliamentary Unit, was deliberately housed not next to government, but in a Salvation Army social service centre in South Auckland, where some of New Zealand's most deprived neighbourhoods were located. And the unit's purpose was defined as working towards the eradication of poverty in New Zealand. It undertook this purpose by seeking to engage with those people who actually impacted the agenda, New Zealand's social and economic agenda. And on the whole, these individuals identified were generally leaders in the community, government, politics, business, and commerce. And so a way was found of engaging with them. The methodologies that were used in the engagement with these leaders included an annual program of social policy research in which we identified those things which were troubling our social services and which need to change. And so we had a program of social policy research. We had regular publications to provoke and stimulate debate from our theological and biblical understandings around issues of social policy and social justice. There was deliberate engagements with 400 or so individuals seen to be the most influential in creating public policy. So we identified those people whose lives and whose situations actually most impacted New Zealand's social and economic policies, and we engaged with those people and we brought to them our research. The organisation of an annual National Just Action Conference focused on issues of biblical justice, social policy and social justice. The judicious use of the media to raise public awareness on key social policy issues. So we saw that we had that when people came for service with the Salvation Army, what they were in fact was saying, I will allow you to interrupt my life and be engaged in deeply personal aspects of my life, but don't let this continue to happen to other people, and therefore engage to change the situation. And you need to highlight that in the media and other ways. And the establishment of relationships with individual politicians and political parties represented in the New Zealand Parliament to the extent that every politician is visited in the term of a parliamentary term. One of the most influential pieces of work undertaken by the unit is the publication of an annual State of the Nation report. There's six years reports now, and at the beginning of each year, the Army brings its theological and biblical framework alongside public policy examining the state of New Zealand's children, the adequacy of work and income policies, the adequacy of housing provision, progress in eliminating crime and moving towards a more rehabilitative punishment regime, and progress on a range of social hazards. So these reports are provided, and they are then officially launched by Salvation Army leadership, and they then become documents for the media and for community debate, and often for parliamentary debate. And this year, for instance, there were 5 or 6 questions in the House of Representatives when the government actually actively debated this report. Now, in the early days of releasing this report, leaders were nervous about it. I can remember a leader who is now in this territory, Commissioner Bell, who was quite nervous about the fact that we were about to release this document. And that was understandable because in terms of that context, this was, you could say that this perhaps would immediately affect our funding, would affect our reputation. But what we've been able to develop in New Zealand over a period of time is an understanding with government that we will critique them, that we will raise questions which are difficult, and yet we will continue to develop, deliver services. Apart from its external influence, the work of the Social Policy Unit has been influential in supporting a renewed understanding and outworking of the foundational beliefs of biblical justice in the life of Salvationists. Deepening awareness of injustice has caused an increasing group of Salvationists to be interested in social justice. Social justice has become part of the Territory's mission's goals, with one of 4 mission goals being to fight injustice. 10 years ago, such a social reform mission goal would never have been accepted as a strategic goal of the Salvation Army in New Zealand. Without at all diminishing its place as an evangelical church and social service provider, the Salvation Army in New Zealand has become increasingly known as a movement for social justice and institutional change. Recently, in an external review of the Social Policy Unit, the head of a leading government ministry said, "The Salvation Army is the strongest church voice in New Zealand in terms of advocating for social economic change. Members of Parliament get jittery when they know a Salvation Army report is imminent." There is no doubt that the Salvation Army in New Zealand is more intentionally integrating its theology with its mission to serve suffering humanity. It is better articulating the truths of the gospel in collective situations and environments. In doing so, it has found it is possible to be a provider of social services, receiving government funding, and still provide robust critique and criticism from our theological and biblical understandings of that government social policy. We are making a pastoral response by linking people to communities of hope and to social and spiritual holiness in new and exciting ways. This linking of theology and service has produced an army willing to fight for what it believes and prepared to challenge the leadership of the nation where appropriate. For many in the community, outside of the Salvation Army, and perhaps for a group of people who would have been normally a bit questioning of the Salvation Army, this has been a welcoming development in our public ministry that they feel is worthy of their support. And so often we have a wider public support. I'm not saying that we haven't lost some support because we've been more politically engaged, but what we have done is we have actually enriched a whole area of public support that we didn't have previously. In New Zealand, then, the better integration of Salvation Army theology in our mission of serving suffering humanity is contributing to a unification and renewal of the missional purpose of the Salvation Army New Zealand. It is helping us bridge the great divide between church congregation and social expression by returning us to the intention of God for the church, that we would be integrated in our mission expression, that we would proclaim the actuality of God's integration with the social and public spheres of this world. God is present and invites us to be present also.
Thank you very much indeed, Campbell, for that articulation of that real historical outworking in New Zealand of the answers to those questions that we asked. How does our theology help us to serve suffering humanity? Now, I've invited, please, we're going to invite Captain Nick Cloak to respond on your behalf to Campbell's paper. Thanks, Nick.
I have read numerous theological papers over the years. Not long ago, I did a master's and waded through vast amounts of theological material. But this was the first time, having read Campbell's paper, that having finished it, I spontaneously wanted to give him a high five. I'm going to take a moment to do that now. Okay. It's what you do in the US. Major Campbell Roberts, this is how your paper made me feel. Exhilarated, challenged, inspired, emotional, proud. Let me explain why. I created a word cloud of your paper, and this is what I discovered. The bigger the word, the more frequent its usage. After New Zealand, Salvation Army, theology, and social, obvious words given the subject matter, surprisingly, the most commonly used word is change. That word is used 13 times and recurs in almost every paragraph. It's the undercurrent that runs throughout the narrative. There are three areas of change that were articulated that I want to highlight and pose further questions. The first is the change to a more robust, holistic theology on serving suffering humanity. The catalyst for change appears to be a territory where Salvationists have more deeply understood and appreciated the Salvation Army's historical mandate and theology. In other words, developing a deeper understanding of who we are and what we do. This is surely necessary for every territory in every generation. This poses such questions as what tools for theological reflection can we share? How do we facilitate change? Are there theological resources on issues of serving suffering humanity that can be shared across contexts? The second change was the change to new and innovative practice, reconciling core and social ministry. Emerging from the theological reflection appear to be some compelling ministry developments, including an emphasis on Christian community in social centres, the blurring of traditional boundaries between evangelism and social action, the emergence of integrated social ministries in core, the diversifying of core membership. A couple of questions. Does integrating social ministries into core programs enhance or diminish evangelism? If core become more diverse, how can that diversity be reflected in leadership and in worship styles? The third change that I saw in this paper is the change to instate social justice as an essential component of serving suffering humanity. I found this the most impressive part of the journey. Without doubt, it's never enough to meet a need without attempting to tackle a root cause. As an international organization with a 150-year record of serving suffering humanity, we have more than enough credibility to speak up on a whole range of issues. It made my heart glad to read that politicians get jittery. It means the Salvation Army voice really counts. I have questions, though. How easy is it to balance a robust critique of government social policy whilst receiving government funding? How should we approach partnership in building alliances for justice seeking? How can we ensure the work of social justice filters down beyond the territorial level to the local setting? How far can we go in coordinating justice responses across territories? These three changes challenge anyone with ears to hear. Change is uncomfortable, it's risky, and it requires the ability to hold your nerve. It's also a constant requirement in response to shifting context, fluctuating needs, and the refining fire of the Spirit. I commend your territory for its pioneering spirit. It's reflective of the values at the heart of the Salvation Army movement, to which we're all proud to belong. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. We've had 2 excellent papers and 2 courageous responses, and I want to invite now for you to do the work at your tables. The questions you should all have, you all got a copy of the questions at the tables. And can I just clarify, does each table have a facilitator? Yes? And each table has a recorder? All right, thank you. What we need to do, friends, is recognise we have about 9 minutes for each question. So for the facilitator, please to control that process, 9 minutes perhaps for each question, because we'd love to get responses on those 4 questions that have been outlined here on your paper. So I'll leave it to your tables to work now. Thank you.